A man who made the world laugh for over 7 decades. Someone who turned Hitler into a punchline and cowboys into satirical gold. But behind the laughter, behind the genius that gave us Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein, there was someone Mel Brooks truly hated. Someone who pushed him to the edge, drove him to fury, and made even this comedy titan lose his cool. And no, it wasn't who you think. The story I'm about to tell you reveals a side of Hollywood's funniest man that few people ever saw, a darkness hidden beneath all those belly laughs. This is the untold story of Mel Brooks and the person he hated more than anyone else. Mel Brooks didn't just make movies. He didn't just create comedy. He crafted a legacy that would outlive generations, turning taboo subjects into box office gold and making audiences across the world roar with laughter at things they never thought they could laugh at. But every genius has their kryptonite, every king has their nemesis, and for Mel Brooks, that nemesis wasn't some rival director or bitter critic. It was far more personal, far more complicated, and far more devastating than anyone could have imagined. To understand this story, we need to go back to where it all began, to the tenements of Brownsville, Brooklyn, where a little boy named Melvin Kaminsky entered the world on a kitchen table because his parents couldn't afford a hospital. Born in 1926, young Mel grew up in crushing poverty. His father died when he was just 2 years old, leaving his mother to raise 4 boys alone during the Great Depression. She worked 10-hour days just to keep them fed, and little Mel, the youngest of the bunch, quickly learned that the only currency he had in this world was laughter. He discovered that if he could make people laugh, they would love him. If he could be funny, he wouldn't be forgotten. This wasn't just a talent, it was survival. It was armor. It was his way of saying to the world, I'm here, I matter, pay attention to me. And pay attention they did. By 14, Mel landed his first real job at a second-rate Catskills hotel called the Butler Lodge. He wasn't just carrying bags, he was a tumler, a Yiddish term for a jester whose job was to keep guests entertained constantly. His signature move became legendary. He'd put on a derby hat and an alpaca overcoat, grab 2 suitcases, walk to the edge of the diving board, and shout, I can't go on, before jumping fully clothed into the pool. The guests would roar with laughter, and young Mel would feel that rush, that validation he craved more than food itself. It was at this very hotel where he met Sid Caesar, an 18-year-old who was already getting acting gigs. Mel looked at Caesar and saw his future. He envisioned himself not just making people laugh but becoming someone, becoming important, becoming unforgettable. The path to that future, however, was anything but smooth. After serving in World War II as a combat engineer, defusing Nazi landmines and literally fighting the fascists he would later mock so brilliantly, Mel reconnected with Sid Caesar. Caesar had become a television star with a groundbreaking variety show called Your Show of Shows, and he hired Mel as one of his writers alongside future legends like Woody Allen, Neil Simon, and Larry Gelbart. These were the golden years, the glory days when Mel earned $1,750 a week at a time when the average family income for an entire year was less than half that. He was on top of the world, married to a Broadway dancer named Florence Baum, and father to 3 children. But here's where the cracks started to show, where we begin to see the man beneath the comedian. Mel Brooks, for all his genius, for all his talent, had a darkness that even he struggled to control. His first wife, Florence Baum, lived a life that few people know about, a life that reveals just how complicated and difficult Mel could be. He gave her an allowance of $3 a day. $3. This was a man making nearly $2,000 a week, living like royalty in the television golden age, and he gave his wife $3 a day to run a household and raise 3 children. He kept a little black book filled with women's names, phone numbers of his conquests and potential conquests. He regularly came home late, reeking of perfume and excuses. And then one day, he didn't come home at all. The divorce was ugly, brutal, even. Florence fought for years to get adequate child support, and Mel fought back with equal ferocity. He resented every dollar he had to send her way. In later years, when he became even more successful, he promised her 1/3 of all his earnings above $44,000, but even that arrangement came with bitterness and resentment. Friends who knew them both said that Mel treated that first marriage as if it were an inconvenience, a mistake, something that happened to young Mel before he became Mel Brooks, before he became someone who mattered. Florence was relegated to footnotes in his story, barely mentioned in interviews, rarely acknowledged in his autobiography. She was erased, made invisible, as if those 9 years and 3 children never really existed. But here's the thing about Mel Brooks: even as he was destroying his first marriage, even as he was neglecting his responsibilities and chasing every woman who caught his eye, he was also creating comedy gold. He was brilliant in that writer's room with Sid Caesar. His mind worked differently from everyone else's. While other writers would carefully craft sketches with structure and punchlines, Mel would jump on desks, act out characters, throw himself into the material with manic energy that both thrilled and exhausted everyone around him. The other writers called him a talking writer, someone who couldn't finish a sketch on paper but could perform it brilliantly. He was chaos incarnate, but chaos that somehow produced genius. Working with Sid Caesar, however, came with its own dangers. Caesar was a volatile man, fueled by alcohol and prescription pills, prone to explosive mood swings that could turn violent in seconds. One afternoon, as they sat around Caesar's hotel suite working on sketches, Mel started whining that he wanted to go out, wanted to leave, wanted to be anywhere but in that room. Caesar, already irritated and probably intoxicated, suddenly snapped. He threw open the window, grabbed the diminutive Brooks by the ankles, and dangled him outside the high-rise window. "How far do you want to go?" Caesar shouted, holding Mel upside down with nothing but Manhattan pavement waiting far below. "Is that far enough?" Mel, displaying the quick wit that would define his career, responded, "In would be nice." Caesar pulled him back inside, and they went back to work as if nothing had happened. This was the world Mel inhabited, creative, profitable, and absolutely insane. After your show of shows ended, Mel hit a rough patch. For 5 years, he couldn't get work. His salary plummeted from $5,000 a week to $85 for freelance gigs, and those gigs were few and far between. He was reduced to living in a 4th-floor walk-up apartment in Greenwich Village, a far cry from the glamorous life he'd known. He became bitter, angry at the world, angry at his failures, angry at everyone who didn't recognize his genius. This period of poverty and obscurity would haunt him for the rest of his life, creating a paranoia about money and success that would influence every relationship he ever had. Then came the turnaround. In 1965, with writer Buck Henry, Mel created Get Smart, the spy spoof that became a television sensation. But even success came with conflict. Mel insisted on top billing by Mel Brooks with Buck Henry. Buck Henry resented this, felt cheated out of equal credit, and the two men fell out over it. This would become a pattern throughout Mel's career, taking credit, demanding control, pushing collaborators away when they wanted recognition for their contributions. Years later, Henry would bitterly joke that he'd bet Mel Brooks's name would appear 5 times on the credits of any Mel Brooks film. When told about this, Mel's response was telling, "Tell him from me he's wrong. The correct number is 6. He was proud of his need for control, proud of his ego, proud of putting his name on everything. With Get Smart success, Mel finally had the financial security to pursue his real dream, making movies. He had written a screenplay called Springtime for Hitler about a crooked Broadway producer who deliberately creates the worst show imaginable, a musical about Hitler, hoping it will flop so he can keep the investors' money. Every studio in Hollywood turned it down. They thought it was tasteless, offensive, unthinkable. How could you make Hitler funny only 23 years after the end of World War II? How could you satirize the Holocaust when survivors were still alive, still traumatized, still processing the horror? But Mel found a producer named Sidney Glazier who loved the script, loved the audacity of it, loved the sheer chutzpah required to turn Hitler into a song and dance man. Together they raised a meager budget of $941,000, not a penny more, and Mel had 40 days to shoot the entire film. The movie, eventually renamed The Producers, would become a classic, would win Mel an Oscar for Best Original Screenplay, and would decades later become a record-breaking Broadway musical. But making it nearly destroyed everyone involved. Mel wanted Zero Mostel for the lead role of Max Bialystock, the unscrupulous producer who seduces little old ladies to finance his shows. Mostel was perfect, rotund, rubber-faced, explosively funny, a Broadway legend who had won 3 Tony Awards practically back-to-back. But Mostel didn't want to do it. He just played Tevi in Fiddler on the Roof, becoming a Jewish icon, and he didn't want to follow that beloved character by playing a Jewish producer sleeping with elderly women on the brink of death. His agent actually hid the script from him, thinking it was too offensive. Only when Mostel's wife Kate read it and convinced him did he reluctantly agree. From the first day on set, Mel Brooks and Zero Mostel were at war. Mel, directing his first film, was nervous, insecure, desperate to prove himself. He had no idea where to put the camera, no understanding of film versus television pacing, no experience managing a crew or handling actors who didn't automatically defer to him. Zero, meanwhile, was a theatrical giant who despised authority, had been blacklisted during the McCarthy era for refusing to name names before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and had nearly lost his leg when a bus struck him in 1960. He was in constant pain from that injury, forced to wear a heavy brace, and he had no patience for a first-time director who was clearly in over his head. Mel would shout at Zero to deliver lines a certain way. Zero would turn his massive head like a roving artillery gun and growl, "One more tone like that and I'm leaving." Mel would mutter under his breath, "Is that fat pig ready yet?" Zero would announce loudly, "The director?" "What director?" "There's a director here." The crew took sides. The tension was palpable, poisonous, threatening to derail the entire production. Zero had it written into his contract that he didn't have to work past 5:30 because of his bad leg, and he used this clause constantly, walking off set exactly at 5:30 even if they were in the middle of a crucial scene, leaving Mel fuming and helpless. The film's editor, Ralph Rosenblum, later wrote about how Mel's inexperience created chaos. After the first few days of shooting, they watched the rushes and discovered that the actors looked like they were standing on stumps, cut off at the ankles because Mel didn't know how to properly frame shots. They had to reshoot everything. The cinematographer, Joe Coffey, clashed with Mel constantly because Coffey didn't understand the comedy, couldn't see the vision, and thought Mel's choices were not cinematic. Halfway through production, after Rosenblum showed Mel the first 20 minutes of edited film, Mel exploded. He bulldozed his way to the front of the screening room, planted himself in front of the screen, and growled, "I don't want you to touch this fucking film again. You understand? I'll do it all myself. Don't touch it until I finish shooting." Rosenblum was so shaken that he and producer Sidney Glazier sat in a car afterward in stunned silence. Glazier finally blurted out what everyone was thinking, "I don't know why Mel has to do this. Why does he have to make it so difficult?" Things got so bad that Mel banned Sidney Glazier, his own producer, the man who had believed in him when no one else would, from the set. Glazier was smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day from the stress, his nerves were frazzled, and Mel didn't care. He wanted absolute control, wanted no one questioning his decisions, wanted to be the sole author of his vision even if that vision was killing everyone around him. When a journalist from the New York Times came to write a feature about the making of the film, Mel was so abusive to her that the resulting article portrayed him as cranky, difficult, and losing his grip. And yet, despite all this chaos, despite the tantrums and the fighting and the toxic atmosphere, Mel got brilliant performances from his actors. Gene Wilder, playing the neurotic accountant Leo Bloom, gave a star-making performance that launched his career. Kenneth Mars, as the deranged Nazi playwright Franz Liebkind, was hilarious and disturbing in equal measure. Dick Shawn, as the hippie actor playing Hitler, was perfectly absurd. And Zero Mostel, despite hating every moment, despite fighting Mel on every single take, delivered what many consider the best film performance of his career. The takes that made it into the final film were always the quietest ones, the ones with the least volume, the most human moments rather than Zero's trademark theatrical bombast. The movie initially flopped. At its sneak preview in Philadelphia, it played as the bottom half of a double bill after a German sex education film. 5 people stayed to watch it, and one of them was homeless and just wanted a warm place to sleep. "The worst night of my life," Mel said. Reviews were mixed. The New York Times called it shoddy and gross and cruel, while other critics loved it. But when Oscar nominations came around, Mel won for Best Original Screenplay, and the producers began its journey to cult classic status and eventual vindication as a beloved masterpiece. You'd think success would mellow Mel Brooks, would make him easier to work with, would soften those hard edges forged in poverty and insecurity. But if anything, success made him worse. When he made Blazing Saddles, his satirical western that pushed every boundary and broke every rule, the production was plagued by problems. The original stars, Richard Pryor and Gig Young, were derailed by serious substance abuse issues. Cleavon Little stepped in for Pryor, and Gene Wilder once again saved the day by replacing Young after shooting had already begun. Mel fought with studio executives who wanted to cut the most offensive material, fought with nervous producers who thought the racial humor would destroy his career, fought with anyone who suggested he should tone anything down. And then came Young Frankenstein, the brilliant black-and-white parody of classic horror films that Mel co-wrote with Gene Wilder. This should have been a joyous collaboration between 2 friends, 2 kindred spirits who had created magic together in The Producers and Blazing Saddles. Instead, it nearly ended in a fistfight. The biggest battle was over the putting on the Ritz scene, where the monster performs the famous song in Top Hat and Tails. Mel thought it was too much, too silly, would ruin the movie's careful tone. Gene was passionate about keeping it, insisted it was essential, wouldn't back down. Their tempers rose, they shouted at each other, they almost came to blows. Gene finally calmed Mel down and convinced him to keep the scene, which of course became one of the most iconic moments in the film, one of the most beloved scenes in comedy history. Mel was wrong, and somewhere deep down he knew it, and that knowledge burned him. After Young Frankenstein, Gene Wilder never worked with Mel Brooks again. Never. Not once. In interviews, Wilder was diplomatic about it, saying that schedules didn't align or that he wanted to explore other projects. But the truth, which Wilder finally admitted years later, was simpler and sadder: I didn't want to follow Mel anymore. He wanted to be the star. He wanted to be the one in front of the camera, not just behind it, and there wasn't room for both of us. Mel had started putting himself in his movies, playing multiple roles, making himself the center of attention. High Anxiety, History of the World Part 1, Spaceballs, all featured Mel in prominent roles, Mel mugging for the camera, Mel taking the spotlight that once belonged to his actors. And then there's Madeline Kahn, perhaps the single most gifted comedic actress Mel ever worked with. She was brilliant in Blazing Saddles as Lily von Stupp, the Marlene Dietrich parody who sings I'm Tired in one of the most memorable musical numbers in film history. She was hilarious in Young Frankenstein as Elizabeth, the neurotic fiancée whose encounter with the monster becomes a not-so-subtle sexual awakening. She appeared in High Anxiety and History of the World Part 1. And then, suddenly, she was gone from Mel's films. They never worked together again after 1981. Why? Nobody ever gave a straight answer. Madeline was diplomatic in interviews, saying she wanted to pursue other projects. Mel claimed scheduling conflicts. But people close to the productions whispered that Madeline had gotten tired of Mel's need for control, tired of his unwillingness to let actors improvise or bring their own ideas, tired of being treated as a puppet rather than a collaborator. Mel Brooks called Madeline Kahn the single best comedian that ever lived, but he couldn't keep her in his orbit. Just like Gene Wilder, just like so many others, she drifted away from the chaos that surrounded Mel Brooks, the constant fights and control issues and emotional exhaustion that came with being in his world. But here's where we get to the heart of the story: the person Mel Brooks truly hated more than anyone. It wasn't Zero Mostel, even though they fought like cats and dogs. It wasn't Gene Wilder, even though their friendship fractured. It wasn't any of his ex-wives or ex-collaborators or critics or studio executives. The person Mel Brooks hated most was actually someone much closer, someone he saw every single day, someone he couldn't escape no matter how successful he became or how many awards he won. Mel Brooks hated Mel Brooks. Stay with me here, because this is where it all comes together. Every story I've told you, every conflict, every burned bridge, every explosive tantrum, they all stem from the same source: a desperate, pathological need to prove himself worthy of existing. That little boy born on a kitchen table to parents who couldn't afford him, who lost his father at 2 years old, who grew up so poor that laughter was the only currency he possessed, never really grew up. He just got older. He got famous. He got rich. He got every external validation the world could offer: Emmy, Grammy, Oscar, Tony. EGOT. One of only 18 people in history to achieve it. But none of it filled the void. Look at how Mel Brooks treated his collaborators. Look at his insistence on taking credit, on having his name everywhere, on being the center of attention always. That's not arrogance in the traditional sense. That's terror. That's the fear that if people don't constantly acknowledge him, constantly validate him, constantly tell him he matters, he might disappear. He might become invisible again, that poor kid from Brownsville that nobody cared about except as the punchline to jokes. Look at how he treated his first wife and children. Giving Florence $3 a day wasn't about being cheap, it was about power. It was about controlling something, someone, because he felt so fundamentally out of control in his own life. Keeping that little black book of women wasn't about lust, it was about validation, about proving to himself that he was desirable, that he mattered, that he was someone worth pursuing. Look at how he fought with Zero Mostel on the set of The Producers. Zero was everything Mel wanted to be: a larger-than-life presence, a theatrical force of nature, someone who commanded attention just by walking into a room. And Zero had integrity. He'd been blacklisted, lost everything, refused to name names even when it cost him his career. Mel looked at Zero and saw his own inadequacies reflected back at him. So he picked fights, asserted his authority, tried to dominate the one man on set who wouldn't be dominated. Look at how his friendship with Gene Wilder dissolved. Gene wanted to be a collaborator, an equal partner bringing his own genius to the table. But Mel couldn't allow that. Mel needed to be the sole author, the singular vision, the one and only creative force. Sharing credit felt like admitting he wasn't enough on his own, and that admission was worse than death. In his memoir, All About Me, published when he was 95 years old, Mel is remarkably candid about some things and completely silent about others. He talks about his poverty, his mother's struggles, his early failures. He talks about his insecurities, his need for approval, his fear of being forgotten. But he barely mentions Florence Baum. He glosses over the conflicts with his collaborators. He presents himself as a lovable scamp who sometimes lost his temper but was always fundamentally good-hearted, always working toward the greater goal of making people laugh. But the people who worked with him tell a different story. They talk about a man who was brilliant but exhausting, hilarious but cruel, generous but controlling. They talk about someone who would give you the shirt off his back but would also explode in rage if you questioned his artistic choices. They talk about a man haunted by demons he could never quite exorcise no matter how many laughs he got or how many awards he won. And Bancroft, Mel's second wife, was perhaps the only person who truly understood him. They met in 1961 at a rehearsal for the Perry Como variety show. Mel walked right up to the elegant, Oscar-winning actress and said, "I'm Mel Brooks. You're beautiful. Let's have coffee." She was charmed by his audacity, his energy, his refusal to be intimidated by her fame and beauty. They married in 1964 at City Hall in Manhattan, and they stayed together for 41 years until her death from cancer in 2005. And grounded Mel in ways no one else could. She supported him when he was broke, believed in him when studios rejected his scripts, stood by him through the chaos of his early directing career. When he came home at night, she once said, "My heart starts fluttering like the party's going to start." She loved him completely, accepted his flaws, managed his moods. And Mel, to his credit, worshipped her. He called her the love of my life, credited her with making him a better person, said that every good thing in his life came from her. But even and couldn't fix what was broken inside him. Even her unconditional love couldn't fill that void that had been carved out in childhood, that fundamental sense of unworthiness that drove him to create masterpieces and destroy relationships in equal measure. After and died, Mel was devastated. Friends said he became a shadow of himself, lost in grief, unable to find joy in anything. He never remarried, never even dated seriously. At 99 years old, as of 2025, he still talks about her in interviews with tears in his eyes, still credits her with being the best thing that ever happened to him, still considers her death the worst loss of his life. And here's the tragic irony. Mel Brooks spent his entire career making people laugh by mocking things they were afraid of. He took Hitler, the embodiment of evil, and turned him into a ridiculous song and dance man in Springtime for Hitler. He took racism, that ugly American reality, and skewered it brilliantly in Blazing Saddles. He took classic horror movies and turned them into loving parodies that honored and mocked them simultaneously. He built his entire career on taking scary things and making them laughable, robbing them of their power through comedy. But the one thing he could never mock, the one fear he could never defang with humor, was his own sense of inadequacy. That scared little boy from Brownsville, that kid who made people laugh so they wouldn't forget him, that teenager jumping into swimming pools fully clothed just to get attention, never left. He just got buried under layers of success and fame and fortune, but he was always there, always whispering in Mel's ear that he wasn't good enough, wasn't talented enough, wasn't worthy of the success he'd achieved. This is why Mel fought with everyone. This is why he needed control so desperately. This is why he pushed away collaborators who wanted equal credit and ended friendships over creative disagreements. It wasn't about ego in the traditional sense. It was about survival. It was about protecting himself from the annihilation he feared would come if people saw through him, if they realized he was just Melvin Kaminsky from Brownsville pretending to be Mel Brooks, the comedy genius. The person Mel Brooks hated most wasn't Zero Mostel or Gene Wilder or any critic or executive. It was the version of himself that he could never quite silence, that internal voice telling him he wasn't enough, would never be enough, couldn't possibly deserve the acclaim and success he'd achieved. Every fight, every burned bridge, every act of control and credit stealing, they all stemmed from that fundamental self-hatred, that core belief that he was fundamentally unworthy. And the truly tragic thing? He was wrong. Mel Brooks was a genius. He revolutionized comedy, pushed boundaries no one else dared to push, created works that will be celebrated for centuries. The producers, Blazing Saddles, Young Frankenstein, these aren't just funny movies, they're cultural touchstones, works of art that changed what comedy could be and do. He earned every accolade, deserved every standing ovation, legitimately achieved EGOT status through talent and innovation and relentless dedication to his craft. But he couldn't see it. Or rather, he could see it intellectually but couldn't feel it emotionally. The awards didn't fill the void. The laughter didn't silence the doubts. The love of millions of fans couldn't replace the unconditional acceptance he needed but never quite felt he received. So he kept fighting, kept demanding control, kept pushing people away before they could abandon him or discover he was a fraud. In recent years, Mel has softened. At 99 years old, He does one-man shows where he screens his films and tells stories and basks in the applause he still craves. He's more reflective now, more willing to admit his mistakes and acknowledge the pain he caused. But even now, you can see it in his eyes during interviews, that hunger for validation, that need to be reassured that he matters, that his life meant something. Maybe that's why his story resonates so deeply. We all have that voice inside us, that critical inner monologue that tells us we're not good enough, that we're frauds just waiting to be exposed, that we don't deserve the good things in our lives. For most of us, that voice is manageable, something we can quiet with therapy or medication or the support of loved ones. But for some people, for people like Mel Brooks, that voice is louder, more insistent, more destructive. It drives them to greatness and simultaneously prevents them from enjoying that greatness. It makes them push away the people who love them most while desperately seeking love from anyone who will give it. Mel Brooks made the world laugh for nearly 80 years. He created joy for millions of people, provided escape and entertainment and genuine artistic achievement. But he couldn't give himself the one thing he needed most: permission to believe he was worthy of his success, entitled to his happiness, deserving of unconditional love. That's the real story behind the laughter, behind the genius, behind the comedy legend. Mel Brooks, the man who made Hitler funny, who satirized racism and sexism and every sacred cow he could find, couldn't overcome his own inner critic. The person he hated most was himself, and no amount of success or fame or love could change that fundamental truth. So the next time you watch The Producers or Blazing Saddles or Young Frankenstein, remember that behind every brilliant joke, behind every outrageous scene, behind every moment of comic genius, there was a man fighting demons he could never quite defeat. A man who made the world laugh while secretly believing he didn't deserve to. A man who created masterpieces while hating the person who created them. That's the tragedy of Mel Brooks. That's the story nobody tells. That's the truth hidden behind the comedy legend. And maybe, in some strange way, that's what made him great. Maybe his art was so powerful precisely because it came from such pain. Maybe he could make people laugh at their fears because he spent every day confronting his own. Maybe the reason his comedy resonates across generations is because it comes from a place of such fundamental human truth. We're all scared, we're all inadequate, we're all just faking it until we make it, and sometimes the best thing we can do is laugh at the absurdity of it all. Mel Brooks taught us that nothing is too sacred to mock, that laughter can defang even our deepest fears, that comedy is a weapon against darkness. He just never quite learned to use that weapon on himself, to laugh at his own insecurities and rob them of their power. But we can learn from his example. We can look at his brilliance and his brokenness and see ourselves reflected back. We can acknowledge our own inner critics while not letting them define us. We can create and love and succeed while accepting that perfection is impossible and that being enough is, well, enough. Mel Brooks hated himself, but the world loved him anyway. Maybe there's hope in that. Maybe that's the real lesson. We don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love, to create meaningful art, to leave a lasting legacy. We just have to keep showing up, keep trying, keep jumping into swimming pools in full costume if that's what it takes to make people pay attention. Because in the end, that's what Mel Brooks taught us, that laughter matters, that joy is resistance, that comedy can change the world. And even if he never fully believed he deserved the acclaim, even if he spent his whole life battling that inner voice telling him he wasn't enough, he did it anyway. He created anyway. He loved anyway. He lived anyway. And that, more than any Oscar or Emmy or Grammy or Tony, is what makes Mel Brooks a legend. Not just because he was funny, but because he was human. Flawed, difficult, brilliant, broken, and human. Just like the rest of us, only with better punchlines.